So after that cheery note, so I want to talk about what you can do about it, as opposed to all the different things that you can come up as bad stories. And one of the things that you can do about it is understanding human nature better, because if you think about a lot of these things, a lot of them have built in them implicitly a model of humans that is, rational. Why are those idiots not paying attention to the data? Lots of data. But also humans aren't very rational. And also, it's a model of humans as greedy, as being individual. And we know from lots of things that that is flat wrong, period. However, they can be greedy, okay? And it's important to understand the differences between those two things. Okay? So let me just show you some examples. So this is just one example of the sort of behavior that you see humans do, but you also see almost all animals do this too. It happens to be credit card data, but it could be location data, it could be almost anything, phone calls, it could be. What people do is we have this core of habits. So think of a rabbit getting up at 8 o'clock every morning, going to the berry bush, eating some berries, and coming back every single day. And then one day, the rabbit just sort of runs around and ignores the food for a while. Looks crazy. It's non-economic behavior in the normal sense of things, but it's called foraging. You're trying to build up a model of what's going on to expand the possibilities. And humans do this too. We're not really aware of it, but that's what you do when you go on a little splurge on the weekend or go out at night. And it's interesting to know that people do that because it's this diversity of ideas that actually characterizes a lot of human life. So habits, exploration. So this is data from a few 100,000 people in Southeast Asia. This is a middle income country. And what you see here, this is ego's location entropy. What does that mean? That means if you get around to a lot of different people in a lot of different places, so you have diversity of experience, that means you have diversity of opportunity. And guess what? You make more money. If you're confined in a ghetto in some way, you don't have that diversity, and guess what? You're dirt poor. And what's interesting about this, so here's a typical rich person looks like low-income person. What's interesting about this, I didn't talk about IQ. I didn't talk about male, female. This is a country that has caste. So I didn't talk about caste. The very top caste is a little different than the others, but only very little different. What's interesting is if you take people who are functionally illiterate, that curve moves just a little bit. If you take people with postgraduate degrees, it moves a little bit that way. So all this stuff about education is a minor effect. All the things you've probably taught and think about are minor effects, as opposed to being connected in society, having diversity of opinion, of opportunity, diversity of experience, things like that. And that's why people all show this exploration. That's why animals do it too. It's not unique to humans. It's not a rational behavior in the classic sort of economic sense. You can see some things. So for instance, I just showed you a curve. So this is Cote d'Ivoire. And what we did is we went and we mapped every precinct. This is at a slightly larger scale. In terms of, it's called a multiphasic poverty index. So this is, it turns out that poverty, infant mortality, crime, life expectancy all co-vary. They're the same thing. It's not different, okay? So if you look at the pattern of communication, and that can be physical communication, it can be phone calls, it can be lots of things, or ways to measure this. If you have a community that doesn't talk much among itself and isn't connected to the rest of society, it has a very high poverty score. What that means is I can look at phone records for a district and tell you how many babies die. And I can, seriously, and I can do this accurately. And I can do it in England, and I can do it in Africa, and I can do it in Latin America, and it's the same.
That's really interesting. It's a very different story about human life. It's a story about humans as being embedded in society, not humans as economic actors. There's a lot of things you have to sort of expand on it. But here's another example. So a few years ago, I gave phones to everybody in a small community. And in return, they let me bug them. Right? It's a medical experiment, so federal approval and stuff. But what you found is, and I did one really nasty thing to them, and the nasty thing is you couldn't use your phone in the morning unless you answered a bunch of questions. And the questions were things like, do you feel nauseous? Is your nose dripping? Are you coughing? Do you feel sad and depressed? Do you feel stressed out? Those are just a few questions, but you had to do that, otherwise you couldn't look at your phone. You can just imagine, right? But what we found is that this exploratory behavior was a huge signal of people being sick, either depressed and stressed or physically ill. And that eventually turned into a company, and Kaiser Permanente, which is the largest vertically integrated health care service in America, uses it for its chronic health patients. So people with congestive heart failure or diabetes, the doctor will say, well, you should put this on your phone, and it's like a check engine light, right? When your engagement with society changes, a nurse gives you a call. And I like to joke, that means either you're getting sick or you're writing the great American novel. You don't really know. It doesn't actually, but about 80% of the time you're not writing the novel, you're getting sick. And the CTO of the United States said, this is an innovation that will save our health system. What he meant by that is if you can get to people before they're really sick, you can fix them, and you can fix them cheaply, as opposed to waiting 2 or 3 months and they're dragged into the emergency room, and then it's not easy and it's way expensive. Again, a different way of thinking about society and about humans. It's not the sort of thing that we normally think of. Now, I rag a little bit on this sort of rational actor model, but let me just point out a thing to you, which is that those models came in the late, sort of 1700s, so Adam Smith and all that, John Locke, etc. Our voting system is based on that. One man, one vote. Right? So it's like the assumption in there is that we're all rational and acting in our best interest, our best individual interest, and we don't talk to each other, as if fads and fashions and panics don't happen. But they do, right? And so our voting system is not actually set up to deal with that, okay? Now, I don't have a good suggestion. I have a bunch of suggestions, but it's not clear what to do. But it is important to notice that some of the things you see going on are because we have the wrong model of society and the wrong model of humanity. So here's one more example. So I sit with the board of directors of Telefonica, and I talk them into releasing aggregate data for London, along with crime data from the police precincts. So aggregate data means basically how many people are at each cell tower, in the morning, in the evening. It's no personal data. It's the sort of thing you could do if you could assign somebody to every street corner. You could collect this data, right? And what we found is that these changes in exploration, changes in mixing between different neighborhoods, signaled stress in the neighborhood. So if you're in a city square and suddenly the old people stop coming, or the people from the neighboring town stop coming, something's wrong. Now, it could be something very benign, the store closed, there's a better attraction down the street, but about 50% of the time it has to do with increased crime. So for instance, in Medellin, in Colombia, where we actually help the government do various things, they use this as a way of allocating police forces. So when they see, so I like the joke, you send a social worker and you send a cop, right? Because it's going to be one of the two. They claim quite large changes in being able to deal with crime. So these are techniques you probably haven't seen before, right? You might have lots of questions about them. They're sort of new. But 2 years ago, I joined a special advisor group for the UN Secretary General who was putting together the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals are the 15-year goals of the United Nations. The previous ones were called the Millennium Development Goals. So it's now 2016, so we finished the first goals. Some of them worked brilliantly. We've had more poverty reduction than ever in humanity, period, full stop. However, many things didn't work. So some of the inequality things, some of the violence, forced migration, but those were the ones we couldn't measure and couldn't give feedback by, and couldn't catch early. And so this time, what they wanted to do is build measurements in for these development goals. And there are things like forced migration, violence, sustainability, a whole variety of things. In fact, there's 171 of them to give sort of depth to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And every national statistical office on Earth is supposed to begin producing these measures regularly. It's really interesting because you can do this cheaply. What you're doing is you're taking data from our systems like cell phones and credit cards and buses and all that stuff. And you're saying, where are the people? Where are they moving? Are they mixing? Are they not mixing? Right? Do you see people forced out of their homes and moving? You know, we don't, all those people that are dying in the Mediterranean, you know, they came from someplace. And in fact, almost all of them, all adults, have cell phones. You could have watched them. You could have said, hey, this is bad. Let's do something about it. Well, so every country in the world has signed up to this. They don't quite know how to do it. You might be skeptical that it will happen, and I'll tell you why it might happen, and that is that people like the World Bank and Britain and the US are going to make aid conditional on having measurements. What does that mean? Well, that means that governments will be far more transparent than they ever have before and far more accountable. When you put a program in, it's supposed to reduce unemployment, right? Okay. Well, you're going to be able to see after a month, 2 months, 3 months what's happening. Today, you put a program in, guy, meets in New York, says, oh yeah, we're doing great. You really don't know, right? So that's the promising thing. It hasn't happened. It doesn't necessarily gonna happen. We have to sort of keep pushing them, right? But the idea of much greater transparency and accountability and a better understanding of society is the prospect that you can come away from for this. To do this, you need to be able to handle data. You should be scared of data. We're generating data about all sorts of things. That's what permits understanding society and better models of people. But it also threatens privacy, and it's also the totalitarian tool, if you had to pick one. So we need to have a new way of actually dealing with data and dealing with the ecology of data and data use. And so I have a project supported by the French government and the World Bank and several large companies to be able to put in place an ecology that gives people much more control over their data and at the same time is dramatically more secure. Okay? Gets rid of passwords. It actually is the case that under this sort of thing, you could have people break in, steal the disk drive with the data, and it wouldn't do them any good because the data is never decrypted. And we know from Snowden's papers that if it's never decrypted, if you compute on encrypted data with guaranteed permissions, guaranteed auditability, guaranteed transparency, and these are cryptographically guaranteed, then even the NSA has an extraordinarily hard time doing it. They can break things, but it costs them a lot. So anyway, so that's stuff you can do. You want to read about it. Well, I'll tell you really quickly. So people think that this is going to change things. Of course, we have to make it happen to actually have the change. So I like this whole shit. So this is from this Chief Technical Officer of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We have a book, self-published book. It gives the roadmap for this. It gives the UN Secretary General statement on it. It gives the World Economic Forum statement on it. It has a Brookings Institute, statement about it. It has a number of other sort of things, experiments that have been done in the area. So if you're sort of geeky or you're a policy person, you might be interested. Okay? Thanks.
Now this part is where the discussion starts, so if you have questions or input, insights, anything, we start that now.
Yes, sir.
Candy, there was something hidden in your subtitle of your book, How Social Networks Can Make Us Smarter.
Yeah.
And I thought somewhere in your talk you were going to say that social networks become a form of digital foraging. Is there something in that that is, as Jeremy talks about human behavior
Yeah.
hurting us? We also know that giving, being part of a community, and you can actually make the opposite.
And that's actually what the data show is that embeddedness in society is the stuff of success, right? In all senses, health sense, wealth sense, things like that. So the question was really, what about digital media? I think, right?
Well, specifically, socializing ideas through social media.
Yeah, so the things that we've been able, so the things that we've been able to do is look at that, because the great white hope for the internet is that it's going to make, all humanity come together. What appears to be the case is that social media cause echo chambers and cause increased polarization. But that should not be understood as an independent effect. It's driven by segregation on the basis of wealth. So in this country, for instance, in the last 20 years, we have become something like 20 to 30% more segregated, not just by race, but primarily by income. And the people in the poor never see the people in the rich neighborhoods. And guess what? They talk about separate things. They have separate concerns. They don't hear each other. The social media reinforce that separate dialogue, and you end up in not a very good place. The best sort of science out there suggests that the root cause is physical segregation. And the biggest effect is and this is true in all parts of the world practically, those big favelas, those big slums, that's income segregation, right? The poor people live out there and they can't get to the central city where the rich people live. I was in Milan earlier this year and they were complaining about that. They said, Milan is now so expensive that it's only rich people that live in the city, and all the workers and all the auto workers live in the periphery and can't easily get into town.
So affordable housing could affect social networks.
Affordable housing, I think it takes more than that. So one of the most interesting things, this is a study by a fellow by the name of Chetty, who was at MIT and is now at Stanford. And he got hold of IRS data in an interesting way. And the single biggest effect for intergenerational mobility, inequality by itself, as is famously known, doesn't cause problems directly. It's when you think that your kids aren't going to have a chance, right? So that's the American dream stuff. The biggest effect there, of all the things he could look at, was, do the people that run the neighborhood live in the neighborhood, or is the neighborhood run by people outside? And the effect seemed to be something that roots in kids. A young, and this is like less than 5 years old kids, do the kids see adult behavior that seems to be something that's rewarded and helps the society? Are there adults they know and ways of behaving that make the world predictable and comfortable? Or do they see a neighborhood where all the adults are buffeted by invisible forces, put out to dry, whatever sort of words you want? And that produced predicted something like 65 to 70% of the variance on intergenerational mobility, which is like amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, Sandy, Sophie Vanbroek from Xerox. You had the slide on the blockchain and how you were going, I believe you're showing it how to use in a transparent, non-corruptible way information around data on individuals.
Yeah.
I mean, many companies, including IBM most recently announcing their blockchain business, are going to use it to securely track assets. In what you're working on, can you elaborate a little bit more on the concept, who would be the miners in your mind?
Well, so blockchains are just ways of keeping a ledger where you can have bad guys acting and it still is trustworthy. You have to have lots of bad guys before it gets bad. So, and any sort of, in my view, any sensible blockchain doesn't have miners. It has verifiers, right? So like I'm a Ripple verifier, whatever that means. Nobody has tried to bribe me yet, so I guess it's secure. The idea there is that people have to have more control over data that is about them. One of the things that means is that you have to know where data goes. Who has permissions to look at it, under what conditions. So I ran a group at Davos for many years that sort of gave rise to the European privacy laws. So Viviane Reding was part of that. She was Justice Minister of the EU. John Leibowitz, who was in this country, head of the Federal Trade Commission, was part of that group too. And the question then is how do you actually implement that, and how do you ensure that it's the case? Also, how do you worry about government actors and other big actors? Are they using the data appropriately? And the bottom line is you need to have, data should be things that are only used with specific permissions for specific things. It has to be auditable so that you know that it happened. And so what that argues is that something like a blockchain can give you this sort of transparency, auditability. And the sort of first stage system we call open algorithms, which means that there's public inspection of the algorithms that are applied to data, and only those are allowed to be used on personal data. And the results from those are logged, so you can see who asked what questions, and you know the questions because you actually have them in computer code. And then the second thing is we know that the NSA and other people will steal data anytime it's unencrypted. So you need a method not only of logging it, but keeping it encrypted constantly. And there's something called homomorphic computing, which is not quite ready for prime time in many people's views, but there's also secure multi-party computation, which has been around for 20 years. And it turns out if you marry that with blockchain, it gets dramatically cheaper. And I don't know if you're interested in the technical stuff, but it's because you don't have to do the Byzantine generals problems. Sir.
Hi, Sandy. Dave Melville from the Bowden Group. So one of the big buzzwords now, or buzz expressions, is zip code lottery.
Mm-hmm.
Where the zip code lottery, where you're born, is the biggest indicator of what your financial future will be. Couldn't that also, so that could reinforce what you're saying, but couldn't that also reinforce simply a caste system that exists?
Sure. Yeah. So that's this intergenerational mobility, I think, if I understand what you're saying. So if you have conditions which, I'm going to be very psychological here, and some of this doesn't have like strong science behind it. It's just based on what the data suggests. So if you have conditions where children get the idea that they are not in control, that it's not their responsibility, that life is just this maelstrom that happens to you, and you might as grab anything that comes by. If that's your life, you're not going to be successful at long-term planning. You're not going to be successful at dedicating yourself to something that will pay off. Even if you have the opportunities, you won't take them. And you may not have the opportunities, of course. So in those conditions, you don't get intergenerational mobility. And what you get is exactly what you said, the zip code lottery. My son is the same as me. Your son is the same as you. Your daughter is the same as you, et cetera. Right? And the American dream has always been, I can be president, or I can be rich, or I can, be better than the previous generation, right? My grandfather had a third grade education, right? He'd be very proud. So it's this notion of giving people the tools to have opportunity, right? So they have to have opportunity, they have to be able to see lots of different parts of society, and they have to have the tools to be able to do that in order to get out of that zip code lottery type of thing. And that's complicated. It's not, there's no like silver bullet to it, but it appears to have happened in different parts of the world in different times. There have been places with a lot of intergenerational mobility. It's not a simple matter. So I hear a lot of things that have to do with, well, we're going to come in and fix the institutions, or something. Yeah, no, sorry. That's part of it, but it's actually a little more. And the core, to me, is you have to have a better understanding of human nature and human society, so you know what are all the control knobs, and if you pull this one, what else is going to run off the rails? So, for instance, in the last talk, it was talked about getting boots on the ground in Africa. It's like, oh no. Right? I think I would be willing to argue that 98% of the places that we've put, lots of aid into, we're going to do it for you, right? Has never worked. It's people there that need to have the opportunities. For instance, I run a program called Development Entrepreneurship. We give grants to young people in developing nations who've shown that they're fighters. You only get in if you're a fighter, okay? You don't have to have won, but you have to be a fighter. They come to MIT for a year, and they get the tools to go back and fight.
Local ownership, yeah.
And it's local ownership, right? And sometimes we help them a little bit by, watching their back. Like a common thing is you go back, and I'm going to get this famous guy to be on your board of advisors, because if he's on your advisor, they won't mess with you. If you go back and he's not on your board of advisors, they'll say, hey, he's just a small fry, squash him, right?
I do a lot of work in Haiti, which is a classic example of no good deed goes unpunished. The more money we pump in, the
Yeah.
more we mess things up.
Yeah. No, it has to be built locally, which means you have to provide opportunity, tools, things like that. But in the end, it seems that they have to build the culture, the society that they want, not the one that we want. Right? So I'm not sure what to do
Maybe
here.
one more? Yeah.
Sort of way in the back corner. He was waving his hand the most. Sorry, guys.
Really wonderful work that you're doing. So, in terms of the systems approach to this, the data approach to this, there's the difficulty of collecting data and securing the data, and then there's like the analyzing the data, because
Right.
some of these problems, it's not like you invest in one thing and you see the effect. They're like
Nope.
variables, right?
Nope.
So put that aside for a minute. But this collecting the data and securing the data using this sort of encrypted approach with blockchain technology, can you just talk a little bit more about that technology and in the particular instance you guys are creating or using, like how far along it is, how does it work, and if is it like ready to go?
So you're right about it, the larger thing. So if you look at Data Pop Alliance, what that is an alliance of MIT, Harvard, a couple other people for data literacy, fundamentally, right? So that societies can understand what data is available, what it means, how to use it for themselves, okay? So that's a necessary and missing component. That said, what we have is we have a sort of version 1 of this that we have done in Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal as sort of one-offs. We've learned a lot about what not to do. But we've also learned about a lot of the potential, particularly for changing health, for changing transportation, for energy, for things like that. And so we have funding from the World Bank and the French government now in partnership with Orange and Telefonica to set up sort of live demonstrators in Senegal and in Colombia, along with these sort of, data labs, which are places where stakeholders can come together and talk about, well, so what does this really mean, and what are we going to do with it, and so forth. And what the data labs do, and what this does, is it makes data from private sources, like the telephone company, the banks, available in aggregate form. It's like census data. But it's census data about where are the people? How do they move around? How much do they spend in different places? How many people are getting sick for each disease, right? So it's a little bit like census data. It has no reference to individuals, right? So it's not something that threatens privacy, and even re-identification has not been possible with that, even with other sort of data sets. And the idea is to ask, what would a sort of a data-rich, data-literate society look like? And in these sort of like for instance in Colombia, they have a civil war, which is maybe coming to the end, maybe. And what they have to do is provide really special opportunity to rural areas now, so that those guys that put down their guns don't pick them back up. Senegal has different sorts of problems, but having to do with, drying out and ethnic violence and stuff like that. But, they have a sort of need for it too. Yeah. Okay?
Thank you,
Sure.
Sandy.